will forever be a legend here at Tottenham. It's a massive club. Everything I do is for the long term.
And still Ricky Villa. What a fantastic run. He scored.
Gascoigne going to have a crack. He is, you know. Oh, he's there.
Here's Lucas Moura. Oh, they done it. The wait for silverware is over.
Well, hello everybody and welcome to another edition of the Tottenham Way podcast, which is being recorded a few hours after another pretty torrid night in the history of this great football club. Basic facts: Spurs have lost again by 3-2 at Bournemouth. That doesn't really begin to tell the story. I'm Marcus Buckland in the company of Tom Allnutt of The Times and Tom Barclay of The Sun. So guys, before we start talking about what happened on the pitch, I think we have to reflect upon what happened off it, both before and after the game. In a moment, the confrontation involving 3 Spurs players and a section of the away support. But first of all, the story actually that seems to be dominating, it's Arsenal Cup. The fact that Thomas Frank was seen drinking a cup of coffee before the game out of a little cup that had an Arsenal emblem on it. And as soon as I saw that, I thought of David Miliband, whose hopes of becoming Prime Minister effectively ended when he was caught eating a banana in a strange way before an election a few years ago. I thought of Steve McLaren.
Ed
Miliband. I do apologise.
It was a sandwich, wasn't it? I think it was a sandwich. It was the front page of the Sun, to be fair.
There was a banana involved as well. So
banana
I think
as well.
both of them.
Banana sandwich?
Both Milibands did something a bit silly. Anyway, and then, of course, Steve McLaren under his umbrella at Wembley in the pouring rain. That became the defining image of his career. I think if Spurs were near the top of the league and doing well in the Cups, the fact that he was inadvertently drinking a cup of coffee out of an Arsenal-styled mug would not matter. But these are difficult times, and I just wonder how significant that seemingly innocent error might prove to be. Tom, afterwards, Frank said it would have been stupid of him to have drunk out of a cup if he'd known it had Arsenal written on it, and he found it extraordinary that everybody was fixating on this particular issue. But in the current circumstances, are you surprised at the amount of publicity it's garnered, and how damaging do you think it might prove to be?
I'm not surprised that it gets publicity. I mean, I think, you're right in a way with those examples, Marcus, because although it's a slightly different sphere, in the modern day media, any clips, any pictures, they are important, whether or not you want them to be important or not. A lot of people see them very quickly, and they can sort of hang on people, unfortunately. I personally think, from a journalistic point of view, I have to say, I think it's a nothing. I think it's a complete nothing, event, really. Like, I was trying to think in my head, like, if you thought about counter examples, imagine Arne Slot was, pictured carrying an Everton espresso cup before a match by mistake. I think it would be something that people would comment about on social media. It might make a story in a couple of, publications in the media, but I don't think it wouldn't be a hurricane like this one, Ultimately, it's the context, isn't it? It's because it comes in the context of bad results, bad performances, Frank being under pressure, unpopular with the fans, etc., etc. That's why it's important. But to be honest, I honestly think that, the mechanics of this are that Frank went into the dressing room before the game, along with other staff, picked up a cup, which I don't know. I was trying to imagine in my mind, they're all stacked up, and maybe if they're stacked up, the Arsenal logo on all of them, you can only see the rims of the cups. Maybe you can't see the logos when you take them out of the stack. Maybe they took them, and apparently lots of other staff took them as well. It wasn't just Frank. And unfortunately, and I personally think quite incredibly, really, nobody noticed. Nobody actually saw that they were holding espresso cups. I guess espresso cups are quite small, so maybe you don't necessarily see. But that was how it worked. I guess one thing I sort of think was nobody clearing the dressing room? Was it no one's job to kind of go in before and do that kind of inspection and make sure that everything was kind of right? You sort of think people do have those jobs, whether that was someone from Bournemouth side or the Spurs side. But listen, the club are obviously, incredulous at the idea that someone was stitching Frank up, first of all. Let's put that one, out there, that it's, by all accounts, nothing like that. No one is trying to make him look stupid deliberately, either from the Spurs side or, of course, from the Bournemouth side. It was just because Arsenal cups were left over in the dressing room for midweek and they picked it up. As I say, I think it's a nothing story, I have to say. But in the context of where we're at, that's why it's picking up traction, isn't it? What do you think, Tom?
Well, I asked the question in the press conference, and I don't think it was asked elsewhere. But I have to say, I'm surprised it wasn't asked. You can say what you want, Tom, about it not being something of nothing, but it's the only thing that people were talking about last night until there was, the fan reaction. And I actually thought, Marcus, you were going to start with Cristian Romero's post because that's an even bigger deal that we'll come on to. But yeah, it was like, the context of it of bad results obviously inflames the situation massively, and why people are leaping on anything to batter Thomas Frank with. But I do think any manager that is pictured holding an Arsenal Cup for Tottenham has more significance than Tom's sort of pointing out. Obviously, he didn't mean it, and it was a mistake, and I really feel for him, and I understand why he said it's sad that I'm even being asked this, but I think it had to be asked. But here, for example, Tottenham's training ground, all the fire, what do you call them? When you're putting out, the word is escaping me after a little sleep. If a fire goes off, fire extinguishers is the word I'm going for. None of them are red. Okay, none of them are red at Tottenham's training ground because red is Arsenal. This whole thing between Arsenal and Tottenham, the colour red is really important. So the idea of being caught with not caught, but pictured holding an Arsenal Cup, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for Tottenham fans. It's obviously a mistake, and I'm not saying that. And I do really feel for him, and I can't believe it wasn't sort of spotted beforehand. It's just one of those ridiculous things. The way it's going at the moment for him just feels like every little thing is going against him. But I do think that the question had to be asked, and I do think it is a story in its own right to a certain extent. And the thing that I really hope is not the case is that this ends up being the enduring image of Thomas Frank at Arsenal. Well, I hope it's the image that people remember during a very rocky start before he goes on to be successful. But my fear is that not going to be the case.
But Tom, I mean, I take all those points, and by the way, completely valid to ask the question in the press conference. Of course, like I'm not saying it's not a story. I'm saying that just what do we learn here? Like, what's the lesson from this? Like, does it tell us anything about Thomas Frank as a manager? Absolutely not. I think we're all agreeing, right?
Yeah. Only if for some mad reason, he did it intentionally, would it mean anything on that front? I just think, obviously, he didn't. So, yes, you're right on that.
It's clearly just an honest mistake, a stupid mistake, but an honest mistake, which unfortunately in kind of social media world, quickly, gains momentum. But it doesn't tell us anything about whether Thomas Frank is the right man for Tottenham going forward, honestly. And it can be a thing, but I sort of sympathise from both sides, I have to say.
Well, let's park that thing. And never mind fire extinguishers, Tom B, but the alarm bells are definitely going off. After the game, we had three
Also,
Spurs
we should say,
players.
by the way, with the fire extinguishers, it's a great anecdote by Tom, but it doesn't stop Spurs wearing red on the front of their bloody home shirt. AIA is in bright red. So, I mean, you can pick on the details in some ways and not others.
You make money out of sponsorship. You don't make money out of fire extinguishers. We will come on to the Romero quotes in a moment, Tom B. But the more vivid image at the end of the game, for me in particular, was Mickey van der Ven, who has looked so miserable of late. Our best player, I believe, at the club at the moment, going over and having some really angry words with a couple of Spurs fans in particular. And he was followed over by Porro and Polinia. Little similar to what happened last year at Bournemouth, of course, when the Spurs fans made their ire very apparent at Ange Postecoglou in particular. What do we read into this? How damaging an image, how damaging in terms of any supposed unity at the club were those scenes, Tom B?
Well, it seems to happen quite on a regular basis, doesn't it? Not just the Spurs at Bournemouth. I think it's because the fans are so close to the pitch that they can really engage afterwards. Obviously, you mentioned Ange last year. That was a striking one. But do you remember Kieran Trippier for Newcastle when they were going for that really rough patch? There was a video of him, basically trying to explain to the fans who were getting really on his back, on his and the team's back, like, we've got all these injuries, what can we do? And it was quite revealing. And I just think it's one of those grounds where that is very possible, as opposed to a West Ham where fans are so far away from the action that it just doesn't happen. Mickey, like I suppose a lot of Dutch players are pretty honest and pretty wear the heart on their sleeves, and I think felt like he wanted to say something, and you can sort of understand, particularly after that. We haven't really talked about the performance, and I wonder how much we'll go into it because we're already moving on to the sort of wider context of or the implications of various things before the game and after the game. But I actually thought Spurs played quite well last night, attacking wise at least. All the criticisms we've had of Spurs being boring, being unambitious, unadventurous, I actually thought they were much better on that front. And yes, they lost, and they've lost in a heartbreaking way right at the end. To sort of be booed at the end of that, I imagine would have stuck in the craw more than it has done in recent games. And you can tell Van der Ven is someone who can easily get frustrated by the reaction he had when he came off the pitch, when the whole incident of snubbing Frank and other games as well. So I don't know how much I read into that as a sign of disharmony within the squad. But we already know earlier this, between the squad and the fans particularly, it felt like a sort of an emotional moment. But I suppose we already know from earlier this season that there's been other incidents of a disconnect between the supporters and the squad specifically. That's before we talk about the manager and the club overall. So I guess it just adds a further example of that.
Listen, we will come on to what happened on the pitch in a moment. I mean, a few little stats very quickly before I ask Tom about the Romero quotes. Bottom line, 2 wins in 12 now in the Premier League. Spurs 14th, exactly the same position as they were this time last year under Ange Postecoglou. Only 4 teams have had fewer shots than Spurs this season. However, we have scored 30 goals, which is better than 8 other clubs. We've only, in terms of touches in opposition boxes, only 4 teams are worse than us. We're in 16th place in that regard. Huge stat, and particularly relevant, I think, after, well, certainly the 3rd goal last night when Jed Spence just gave the ball away. 25 errors from Spurs players have led to shots on our goal, and invariably most of those seem to go in because players like Semenyo last night score worldies against us. But to back up what Tom just said, we had 16 chances against Bournemouth. Now, our average shots per game this season, 10.2, which is the lowest since the 1997-98 campaign. We averaged 13 last season. So the fact that we created 16 in 90 minutes at Bournemouth was, I thought, encouraging. But afterwards, Romero, the captain, Tom, who I thought had another iffy game, it has to be said, produces quite a lengthy set of comments on Instagram. I shall put on my glasses, it's that serious, just to read out what he says. Apologies to all of you fans who follow us everywhere. And who will continue to do so. We are responsible. There's no doubt about that. I'm the first. But we'll keep facing up to it and try to turn the situation around for ourselves and for the club. At times like this, it should be other people coming out to speak, but they don't, as has been happening for several years now. They only show up when things are going well to tell a few lies. We'll stay here, working, sticking together and giving our all to turn things around, especially at times like this. Keeping quiet? Well, issuing posts like this on Instagram doesn't suggest you're going to keep quiet. Working harder and moving forward all together. That is part of football. All together, it will be easier. And Pedro Porro immediately endorsed that particular message. Now, I'm surprised. It's not the first time he's done this, Tom A. But I think there's a degree of hypocrisy in what he's saying, because 1 minute he says we, the players, are responsible. Then he starts to cast these aspersions towards the top of the club again before saying we're going to keep quiet and stick together. None of that, on the face of things, seems to make sense. What's your reading of those remarks from Romero?
Yeah, I mean, we should say that, Frank, we're doing this podcast before Frank's press conference this afternoon. So from a kind of formalities point of view, the club haven't, as we're speaking now, spoken to Romero. He hasn't arrived at the training ground yet. Frank will, I'm sure, clarify, and people will probably, I've already heard what the kind of club are planning to do about it, whether any action will be taken. I mean, it's not the first time, is it, with Romero? I sort of was, every time we write about Romero, we have a kind of a charge sheet, of the kind of 4 or 5 times he's come out and said things against the club. We also had that interview, obviously, where he said he would like to play in La Liga one day, which everyone interpreted as basically a sort of get me out of this club kind of interview early last year. We had, shots fired at the board before, where he said that, people who, need to take responsibility don't take responsibility in this club. And yet Romero was made vice captain by Ange Postecoglou. He was made captain by Thomas Frank. There's clearly something, in his personality that managers want to kind of harness. I remember Ange saying, we need a team of Romeros, and he was very much kind of trying to get on Romero's side. And I think Frank has probably done the same thing. I think I'm slightly in two minds, I have to say, because I think as a captain and as a sort of spokesperson for the club, Romero is a bit of a nightmare, isn't he? He continually kind of shoots from the hip all the time. He's uncontrollable. The club never know what he's going to say when he does press conferences or interviews. He's completely, he's not a sort of company man. Let's say that. Equally, there is part of me, Marcus, and maybe you disagree, but I wonder if Spurs are slightly lacking in these kind of characters, and not just on the pitch, actually. I have to say around the club generally, I think that perhaps Tottenham are slightly light on players like Romero and personalities like Romero. And I don't want to use the word winner because I think it's a bit cliche, but I think people who have high standards, who are demanding and who basically don't accept mediocrity. And I think, there's a little bit of contradiction there because Romero's form recently has been, mediocre would be generous. Against Liverpool, for example, his red card, killed the game, and he has been, there have been mistakes. He really hasn't been at the top of his form in the last 6 months. If anyone needs to look at themselves, it's Romero. Let's just, lay that out there. But I do think generally, Spurs have the look of a club at the moment who is slightly accepting mediocrity, accepting another season in mid-table, accepting a squad which doesn't look good enough. We're already kind of a week into January, and we're not really seeing the kind of bold moves that perhaps we thought the squad needed. And is it actually the case that we can maybe our first reactions is say, well, look, Romero's not a good captain. Maybe these are the kind of slightly troublesome characters, if you like, that the club need to kind of expunge. But actually, on the flip side, is it actually that maybe they need more people like this who actually demand things and actually really want things? I know, for example, that Paratici is a bit like this off the pitch. But he is someone who demands really high standards all the time. And it can be really difficult to work with, that it can be sometimes, Fabio, like, why are you having a go at me about this, But actually, you need people like that in a club, And so I guess I'm slightly split on it because I think you think, don't you, Marcus, that ultimately he hasn't been good enough. And so why is he kind of, taking pot shots at other people? And I think I accept that. But I do also think there's a side to Romero's personality maybe Tottenham need more of as well.
I just think that in the current circumstances, to come out with some of those quotes in particular, and Tom B, the one that really jumps out is, when he's referring to the hierarchy, they only show up when things are going well to tell a few lies. As the captain of the club, you can't be saying that in public, can you?
No, because it's actually been taken out of the post now. So it did have that line in it, and it seems to have gone when I looked at it again this morning. So that would suggest that no, you cannot say that. Be interesting to see what kind of reaction there is from the club towards it. I find it interesting because my understanding was that him and Romero and Daniel Levy didn't have a great relationship, but obviously he signed a new contract when Levy was here, made the captain, then Levy left. It does feel like, when reading between the lines of that post, like maybe there were certain promises made to Romero that haven't been delivered on. That would be, I think, what a lot of fans will be asking themselves, and that's why he feels like he can speak up right now. There's no doubt that Romero has quite a sway in the dressing room. He's a very influential player. Very much got the sense of that last season, particularly when writing my book, that he was very much a leader of the players, and not just because of the sort of Spanish, not just the Spanish speaking contingent, but just a lot of players who seem to really respect him. He's not, despite the sort of full-blooded tackles, he doesn't seem to be sort of rant and rave on the pitch. Not an old school kind of vocal captain, like we think of Keane and Shearer and all that kind of captain. But he is very influential. And Ange definitely really, really rated him. We could see that from his final press conference at Brighton when it was up in the air whether Romero would be staying, whether people even think he should stay. Had he become a bit of a liability with some of the things he was saying? How committed was he? And Ange was very, very clear that, you've got to keep him. He's huge here. And the fact that Frank made him captain straight away kind of backs that up. But I sort of agree with what Tom's saying about the lack of characters, I suppose, in the at Tottenham right now. I do think there's a lack of leaders. I think there's a feeling amongst the hierarchy, or at least from Thomas Frank's point of view, I think he feels like he could do with some more leaders. He keeps talking about character when he talks about potential new signings as being a really big part of it. I think there's a sort of steeliness that is missing within this particular squad, which might explain why they've struggled so many times with setbacks, which is also something they're really trying to work on at Spurs under Frank, which is obviously made harder amid the backdrop of the frustration of the fans. So I kind of, on the one hand, agree with Tom about Romero having that streak about him being a positive, but I really don't think your captain can be saying things like that in public. It only inflames the situation. And, you know, I know he might have been speaking from the heart, but Thomas Frank right now needed this like a hole in the head, didn't he? Ahead of this press conference today, where he was already facing a lot of scrutiny following the Arsenal Cup, another defeat, all that kind of stuff. And now he's got his captain, you know, adding to that massively with this post.
But also, I mean, what can Frank do about it? Let's be honest. Like, Frank isn't in the position right now where he can go to war with Cristian Romero, you know, and I might be completely wrong. And maybe in this afternoon's press conference, Frank is going to come out and say, you know, this was completely out of order. Romero won't play for me again. and I'll happily eat my words. But ultimately, like, he's not in a strong enough position at the moment. You know, the reality probably is that Romero has actually got more authority at the moment at Tottenham than Thomas Frank has. You know, in terms of the players and the fans, he's a bigger draw than Frank is. So Frank can't go to war with Romero at the moment. He can't, in a way, like, he has to try and get him on side. And I think that's part of the thing here, is that when Frank came in, he probably thought, and I think it's a logical thing to think, you know, how do I get this guy on side? You know, if his ceiling is one of the highest in my squad, how can I get the best out of him and get him, you know, on my side from the beginning? And actually, the problem is that he has to kind of keep him on side now, right? Like, Romero probably knows that. He knows that he's probably the biggest player in the team, and you can see that. Like, when you're around the training ground or when you're at games, you can see the sort of, I don't know if it comes across on telly as much, but you can see the aura that Romero has, you know, on the pitch. You know, he calls people over for chats. He's the one in the huddle. He's the one who sort of has the swagger and the armband. He is the leader of this team at the moment, rightly or wrongly. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of, I don't know, like almost like Aubameyang, for example, at Arsenal. Like, maybe it's the kind of thing that if Frank in 2 years' time is still at Spurs and he's got a little bit more weight and a bit more credit in the bank, then maybe that's where you make a big decision. You say, actually, you know, the inconsistent performances, you know, sometimes the lack of discipline, we get rid of that, you know. But at this point, this early in his tenure, he just has to swallow it, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, Tom's, if you're watching us on YouTube, you'll see Tom B has just nipped out. Lots happening behind the scenes, and Tom A's getting phone calls from the club. So much is happening at the moment. We are recording this, should make it clear, on Thursday morning, so just a few hours after the Bournemouth game. And the boys, of course, as they said, will be heading back to the club for the preview to the Aston Villa Cup tie shortly. So things could change, but I mean, it's just a really miserable situation for everybody connected with Spurs. We'll take a short break and then we'll talk about the match. We'll talk about some possible signings. And we'll look ahead to that hugely significant tie against Aston Villa. Guys, in terms of the match itself, Spurs levelled late on in really terrific style, thanks to Paulinho, and then lost, I think almost inevitably, in the last minute to Semenyo. I mean, it kind of was there. Dr. Tottenham was coming to the South Coast. Bournemouth hadn't won in 11. Semenyo wanted to go off in style. What can you do, Doc? And he prescribed the home side the perfect remedy. But Tom B, you know, as we've touched upon, okay, Spurs lost 3-2. They could easily have won 3-2. And for that reason alone, I understand the frustration, the growing frustration amongst the supporters. But I must admit, I'm a little surprised at just how negative everybody was after that game. And I accept that defensively they were poor. We've spoken about Romero's form. You know, the first goal for Evan Nielsen, you'd like to feel that should have been cut out. The third goal, I mean, Spencer's made the error. But once again, we seem to be backing off inside our penalty area, allowing shots from distance, and Semenyo takes full advantage of that. So, of course, there were negatives, but would you not agree that actually, bearing in mind who's still missing, there were some positive signs about that
Yes,
performance last night?
yes, completely. And that is why it's so worrying for Thomas Frank that they get a reception like that. I mean, it's a last minute heartbreaking goal. So we know that that's going to, people are going to be emotional after it. So, and Spurs fans are so used to now as their sort of almost go-to response when these things happen is to boo. But booing him and the team after that particular performance felt harsh, but kind of instructive of where a lot of fans are at. They're just seeing, a lot of them seem to be seeing it as just further evidence of him being the wrong man for the job, this project not going the right way, that they can't really take a second to look back and think, actually, there were some positives. At least that's the way I see it. And that tells me that it's going to be a serious oil tanker for Thomas Frank to turn around at this point. But he does have so far he's had the full backing of the board to do that, and he still believes he can. But that's worrying after that particular performance. But I do think when you break it down, there were lots of things to be positive about. I mean, what are the things that we've been really critical of this Thomas Frank side, of being way too negative from an attacking point of view? There's a stat that did the rounds before this game of progressive passes in the league, and Spurs were bottom of it. Progressive passes being, balls, through balls, effectively balls to try and go forward, try and create chances. I noticed within the first couple of minutes before Matisse Tel's goal, there was a ball through from João Paulinho, of all people. He's often the poster boy, isn't he, of the lack of progressive passes after being battered by Jamie Carragher on Sky, and maybe rightly so, I suppose, for his lack of ambitious passes. But he was the one who played the ball through. Lucas Bergvall has a shot from distance, another thing that hasn't happened as much under the Frank regime, albeit it actually has happened a bit more in recent games. So that was just one, and I counted quite a few. I haven't seen the stats exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were relatively high. It felt like there was an ambition there from Frank and his team to try and play a more attacking point of view, and with plenty of players missing. Lucas Bergvall played out right. I actually thought he did quite well there, to be honest. Worrying that he came off injured and looked very frustrated when he did, having come off against Palace. That's something that it's been lost amongst all the other stuff going on, but that could be a big worry. But I thought Matisse Tel down the left had another really encouraging performance. I know no one has really put their hand up on the left-hand side. There's a chance there for someone, unless they sign someone, which they're still trying to do. And I don't know if Frank's really been completely sold on Matisse Tel. I don't think he really sees him as a left winger. But he's stating his case, and he's a young player who can be moulded. Think of Ollie Watkins at Brentford. I mean, obviously he ended up being a striker, went from winger to striker. But the point being is that Thomas Frank has a track record of moulding players into new things that can be really, really effective. And maybe Matisse Tel, with his energy, his enthusiasm, and his wanting of the ball, that's what I feel like Wilson Odobert has been lacking at times. Maybe he's a more talented player out wide, but sometimes you feel like he doesn't really have the confidence to go and show it on the pitch, or not often enough. But I feel like Tel has wanted it a bit more, and obviously got the goal, bit of a deflection, but great start. And yes, they lost. And it was to Semenyo, the man who didn't want to go to Tottenham. All of the storyline, Dr. Tottenham, Bournemouth hadn't won in ages. None of it reads well. But actually, when you think of when they went down 2-1 at half time, you think this could be bad. If there was a moment where after the second goal for Bournemouth, there was fans chanting from the Bournemouth end, Champions of Europe, you're having a laugh, after Spurs had been singing about being Champions of Europe after winning the Europa League. Spurs fans responded with Champions of Europe, you'll never sing that. But then the Bournemouth fans responded again by saying you're getting sacked in the morning to Thomas Frank, which obviously must have been hard for him to hear. But I was sitting there thinking, man, if Bournemouth in the second half end up scoring a couple more goals, I wouldn't be surprised if this chant came back and the Spurs fans would get involved in it as well, which would be really, really sort of toxic and worrying. But it didn't happen. I thought they responded really well. Paulinho scores a brilliant goal, and you say what you want about him being maybe not the most creative player, but he has chipped in with a lot of goals already this season. Mm-hmm. Richarlison hits the post. Romero has that header that goes onto the roof of the net, I think, towards the end. Is it Van der Ven has a brilliant save from Petrovic. So Spurs could have easily won it. And I think you have to take positives from that. And I feel at times, maybe because I and Tom and the other, we try and be as objective as we can, but when we're in front of the guy every week, it's hard not to feel the suffering and the pain that he's going through, and see him more as a human being, and kind of want him to do well. I don't sort of discount that feeling of it, but there have been times maybe in other games where I've been maybe overly optimistic or positive about moments that really aren't that great. It's just because other things have been going so badly that you're looking for things to try and be positive about. But last night, when you look at the performance overall, from an attacking point of view, there are plenty of things to be optimistic about. But sadly, there's all these other issues that have taken it over, and obviously another defeat. So I think a bit of a word salad of a response there, Marcus, but it kind of sums up how I'm feeling on this kind of sleep deprived Thursday morning.
I can see exactly and understand exactly what you're saying. I think, a lot of fans have made up their mind. It doesn't matter now. Frankly, even if Spurs had won last night, I'm sure there'd be lots of them still saying he's got to go. He's got to go. They are absolutely firmly of one opinion that he's just not a Tottenham man, and that's a big problem for him. And of course, if the results continue this way, then he will have to go. I mean, I think, and I'm trying to be as realistic as possible, and I know that by the end last season, I and many others just thought Ange Postecoglou was not the right man for the job. It doesn't mean that I'm now going to continually say, well, Thomas Frank is the right man for the job. That's not a logical conclusion to what happened last season. But I do feel that it's very difficult for him to turn things around now. Your oil tanker comparison was a very good one. There are two huge games coming up, at home to Aston Villa in the FA Cup and then at home to West Ham in the league. Now, of course, we've just allowed Bournemouth their first victory in, 12 games? West Ham, I think, without a win in 10. I mean, failure to win those two games will, I suspect, be the turning point. Although I then say to you, I'd say to Tom Abel, if you're watching us on YouTube again, he's gone off with his phone. I'm kind of hoping he's going to come back in a moment, Tom, and say that he's just heard that Spurs have landed a £75 million superstar, and that's why he's had to walk away for a few moments. And I mean, we need to talk about this transfer situation. But if Frank does go, as the majority of the supporters would hope, what's the alternative? I mean, we've got Manchester United looking for a new manager. They've now, I think, made it pretty clear they're just going to have an interim until the end of the season. I mean, Celtic, not that that's necessarily a direct comparison. Of course, have just got rid of another manager. Where would Spurs go? Would it be the interim? Somebody, I don't know, Ryan Mason's available again after being sacked by West Brom. I don't know. Where would they turn to, particularly here at the start of January, when they've got to bring in some new blood? Who do they entrust to do that if it's not Thomas Frank?
Well, Harry Redknapp was at the game last night. I honestly don't think this is going to happen.
He wants to go to West Ham, though, doesn't he? He said he'd go to West Ham for free.
Unless it gets to untenable levels, I honestly feel like the support for Thomas Frank behind the scenes has been pretty unwavering. And I don't think last night's performance would have changed their minds on that. If they're looking at it from a objective point of view about the performance, the result maybe is different. The more the worry is the things that are coming out of the dressing room. I think Romero's post is very significant. To take aim at the hierarchy will not have gone down well at all. And I suppose it's on Thomas Frank to be in control of his players. And maybe that will be a big sort of negative in the sort of support box. I don't know, but the messaging, the feeling I've got from the club throughout this period when the fans have been raging, from the off, really, ever since that Bournemouth defeat, to be honest, and seem to be against Thomas Frank, has been the opposite. Remember Vinay Venkatesham, who's the chief executive, was at Arsenal for many years. He went through the very rocky period with Mikel Arteta at the start. He helped, stuck with him, and it looks like Arsenal are getting their payoff now with how they're going and looking like they really should be winning the league this season. He knows what it's like to sort of get through that period and stay calm. when everyone is, losing their heads around them. And so those hoping that he goes, the Spurs fans, unless something dramatic changes, that's the sense I very much get, that they're staying with him. I mean, Frank talked about Venkatesham in very glowing terms to Tom Allnutt, actually, in the last press conference ahead of the game, talking about what a great communicator he is and how he knows what good looks like. And there's no doubt that his experience with Arteta going through those rocky few years will have informed him over how to act now. I suppose ultimately it's the Lewis family that are in control, though. It's not the chief executive as much of a, big say he obviously has. So if their feelings change, and historically, it looks like they have. Although it's a weird one, isn't it? It's a new tenure. It's the younger generation calling the shots as opposed to Joe Lewis in the years gone by, albeit was it Daniel Levy? There's a sort of question marks over how different this regime really is. But if it isn't that different, say theoretically it isn't that different, then they've got a track record of hiring and firing managers. So that may come into it. But yeah, I don't really think it's worth at the moment going down this route of who come next. We kind of did that before to a certain extent, but I'm very much getting the sense, I have done, and so far, that they're going to be sticking with him.
Tom is back, and we were hoping, we saw you on the phone. Have you just heard that a £70 million deal has been struck for a superstar? Have you got some good news for us?
I wish. Imagine, that would be fantastic, wouldn't it? Breaking news on the Tottenham way. But no, I'm afraid not. But that's a relevant call, let's say that. But yeah, sorry to be away for 5 minutes. Yeah,
that's okay. Well, we've spoken about the encouraging performance, despite the fact that Spurs lost the game. The fact that, for some Spurs fans, it doesn't really matter what happens now. They want Frank out. Tom, I think quite rightly said, the signs are that the hierarchy are going to stick with the manager for now. I wish we could hear from Vinay again. I mean, the PR at the start of the season was really good. They'd gone so quiet. And I think all Spurs fans would like to know why Brennan Johnson was sold right at the start of the window. George, in the last podcast, spoke really well about how concerned he was by the manner in which he was let go to Crystal Palace for only £35 million. And my response at the time was, well, they must have done that because they have got a supposedly superior replacement coming in. But there's absolutely no sign of that at the moment. And I watched the highlights of the Palace game last night against Aston Villa. Okay, it was a dull 0-0 draw, but actually Brennan Johnson appeared to figure in most of the best moments that Palace had. So that remains strange. I mean, what, if anything, are Spurs going to do in the market? Thomas Frank, every time he's asked, says they're working very hard behind the scenes. Well, of course they are. But that's not enough. They've got to bring somebody in sooner rather than later. And really, they need to bring somebody in before the Villa game, because this has suddenly become arguably the most important game of the season so far. So with your ear to the ground, do you sense that after all this hard work behind the scenes, we're going to see some arrivals sooner rather than later?
I think the thing here, just to pick up on the Johnson point you made, and I thought it was a really interesting discussion you and George had, actually. And if people were interested in that, then I would urge people to go back and listen to that pod, because it presented all the views, I thought, really well. My personal opinion is it probably does look a little bit cheap. But equally, I'm very aware that over the last couple of years, we have spent a lot of time on this pod basically saying that Spurs need to get deals done quicker. They need to haggle less, not worry about the kind of extra 2 or 3 million and spend 2 or 3 weeks negotiating and get deals done. And we can't necessarily say that. And then when they sell someone for 5 or maybe even 10 million less than perhaps they could or should have done, but they do it quickly, we can't then say, well, why do they let him go for 35 million? I mean, I think they basically wanted to get Johnson out the door early because they made that decision. They want to be a better selling club because, as we said in that pod the other day, Spurs' record of selling hasn't been good. And they wanted to basically get the funds in so that they can, have more options in the window. So I think we made the points about Johnson, but I just wanted to make that one. I think in terms of the window, it comes back to that old difficulty. And this is probably the frustration I think that fans are going to have, because obviously you want Spurs to start acting like Manchester City or Arsenal, dare we say it, in the first kind of week and make big moves and do it early. But the problem, what I'm hearing is, and I don't know if Tom's hearing similar things, is that some of Tottenham's targets, are basically reliant on certain clubs, signing their own players. and that then, that player will then become available. Equally, the Africa Cup of Nations is happening, so a couple of targets are also there. So sometimes it's just the mechanics and the practicalities of these things means that it's very difficult to do deals straight away in the first, week. And that, I think fans will probably roll their eyes because we've heard that kind of thing many, many times before. This is why this isn't happening. This is why it's going to take longer. And then, lo and behold, comes the end of the window and things still haven't got done. But I think that is part of the problem. Let's take Semenyo as an example. If Manchester City are going to sell Semenyo and be persuaded to do that deal, which they were in the end reluctant to do last summer, then perhaps they want to get Semenyo in first. And the reason they haven't got Semenyo in first is because maybe they wanted to leave Semenyo to play against Arsenal last week, and obviously against Spurs, in the end yesterday. But, so these things, it's always not just kind of one deal in isolation, isn't it? There's always a kind of knock on. And I think that's the problem that Tottenham are having, that they're not probably prepared to spend, the extra kind of 20 million almost to kind of get deals done quickly, because you have to overspend to do that. They're still sort of playing that waiting game to get targets over the line.
Yeah, but the trouble is, you sell Johnson and then it's unlucky, but it's perhaps almost inevitable that Kudus gets injured. And now it's sounding as though he's going to be out for a lot longer than we initially thought. We still don't know what's happening with Solanke. We still don't know what's happening with Kulusevski. Tom B, you've mentioned that Bergvall picked up another injury. We've mentioned Harry Redknapp a bit earlier. To borrow one of his quotes, they're getting down to the bare bones. And they've got some really important games. First of all, against Aston Villa. And then, although I don't for 1 minute think that Spurs will get involved in a relegation tussle, if they were to drop points to West Ham and Burnley, and then they face a much tougher set of fixtures, they could get embroiled in a really ugly battle towards the bottom of the table, potentially. So, something's got to happen sooner rather than later. Otherwise, just the optics look so bad. You sell Johnson, and yeah, Tom's right. We've got to be a better selling club, but you can't not bring someone in to replace him.
Yeah, the optics don't look good. They need to sign someone, don't they? But I was trying to find out yesterday before the game, who they might be after in the wing position, because we're waiting to see with Kudus, but not sounding great. It hasn't been confirmed yet that he's out for a bad one, but it might well be, which is just so typical. I mean, you say it was almost inevitable. It wasn't, but it was the risk they ran by selling Johnson and not having a replacement in. But, Tom mentioned Semenyo. I hear that he might have a quite a significant injury as well. So it feels like that's going against them too. Oscar Bobb's been mentioned. I'm not sure Spurs are actually looking at him actually, but it sounds like he might be out. Omar Mamouche has also been talked about at Man City, but it sounds like, speaking to colleagues who cover City, who are close to the club, I'm not sure that they want to let him go unless they get a massive offer. I don't think they're really open to loaning him out, even though he's effectively back up to Haaland, which means he'll effectively never play. It's very similar to Harry Kane, anyone who was back up to Kane. And he's obviously a really good player. And he is actually someone that Spurs really liked before he went to Man City. So I don't know, maybe something could change on that front as we get nearest the end of the window. Players want to play. He's obviously at AFCON anyway at the moment. There's the mention of Jan Diomande, another player at AFCON right now. He's at Leipzig, but speaking to Leipzig sources, it sounds like there's pretty much no chance he leaves in this window. And he's got a massive fee on his head anyway. I feel like Spurs, part of the problem is they're in the Champions League, but league-wise, in the last few years, they've obviously they're not been performing like a Champions League club. But they're trying to go for those kind of targets that will, premium targets like Semenyo, that will take them on. But they're struggling to convince those players to come, such as Semenyo, who didn't want to go there and is obviously getting that move to Man City. So that's also the trouble that they're having. But also Tom makes good points about maybe targets they think might be realistic, still have a sort of a conveyor belt or knock-on effect, having to wait for somebody else to sign, for them to sign. I still think they've sold Johnson too early. Yeah, it's obviously easy to say that in hindsight. Now Kudus is injured, but they could have waited a bit longer. Even though Thomas Frank said there was a small window to do it done. I don't know. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but it feels like that could have been held off for a little bit longer. But I think, back to the optics, with all the kind of damage of the last 24 hours, whether it be the Arsenal Cup image or more specifically Romero's post or the Van de Ven with the fans afterwards, Spurs really need a lift of some kind, don't they, now, to change the narrative. They need some leadership, whether it comes to whether it be someone from the hierarchy, probably Vinay, I suppose, speaking to us or us to the fans, via us, would probably help. I wouldn't be surprised maybe if that might even happen. Not that I've heard that it would, but he's not like Daniel Levy. Seems to be more open to talking. He's a very good communicator. Maybe that might not be a bad idea, but obviously the thing that would help more than anything, apart from results, is a shiny new signing that fans can really get behind. And the fact that they've sold Johnson does feel like another indicator that the club are supporting Thomas Frank's vision long term. He didn't fancy him as a starter. They've decided to sell him. Now back him really with a signing that he does want. That would be my hope.
Well, I get that, but then of course there's the added complication, Tomo, that we don't know about Paratici. Every day you're expecting to hear that he's gone off to Fiorentina, and yet he's meant to be at the fulcrum of all this hard work behind the scenes to get players in. You also have a little look at the business that they did at the start of the year, and we were all quite excited when, in particular, Kola Moani came in. I have to say that the more I watch him now, the more naturally concerned we all must be. He has yet to score in the Premier League, and there's a big problem in terms of scoring goals. We've mentioned Richarlison ad nauseum. We've all come to the conclusion that although his work ethic is great, he's not of a sufficient quality. So there are these glaring holes, and yet for all the hard work behind the scenes, you don't quite know who's doing what, whether the main man's about to leave for another club. The silence is deafening, and everything's just adding up towards a midwinter crisis if we've not already reached that point.
Can I just say, I've just had a message from a mate of mine who covers Man City who says Semenyo's out for 2 months. So,
perfect.
Great. I imagine that's correct. So, yeah, unlikely on that front.
Okay.
You mentioned Paratici. The Italian press seem to be pretty sure that he's going to Fiorentina. It's just a matter of when. That is another sort of doesn't look good. What a nightmare scenario that is, really. To go through everything they've been through, Tottenham, to rehire him after the scandal, let's be honest, that he went through, why he had to leave in the first place. He works as a consultant for however many months, comes back in official capacity in October, and if he's gone in 3 months later, that's just, it's not ideal, is it?
That's a joke, Tom.
At a time when the club has been through so much turmoil or change, let's say, at the top of the club, albeit the fans had been calling for that for a long time.
That's it.
It makes for an unstable time for Thomas Frank to try and implement his vision.
But it's a joke from the club's point of view. They stayed loyal to the guy. He wants to go. I don't understand why he's still there. If he's going, Fiorentina presumably want him as quickly as possible to get some players in. We need a bit more stability. So Tomo, what comes next? Well, we know what comes next. It's Aston Villa at home in the FA Cup. And this is a massive game. And we know that Villa, okay, maybe they just dropped off a little bit, heavily beaten by Arsenal, 0-0 at Crystal Palace. They haven't got the strongest of squads. Can we dare to hope that maybe Unai Emery will rest a few players at the weekend in the belief that they can still mount a title challenge? Because if they put out a full-strength side, I don't think many people think that Spurs can beat them.
Marcus, Tom's making me nervous. He's sort of jigging. I think he needs to go. Should we let him go and manage these last sort of 5 minutes ourselves as a duo?
Yes. Unless, Tom, have you just had a phone call, £70 million player that you've heard about?
I think it's more I have to get my son over to my parents to get over to that Spurs presser. But
okay.
Always good, chaps. See you next time.
Cheers, Tom. That's Tom Barclay from The Sun. Tom, this Villa game at the weekend, it's taking on epic proportions, isn't it?
Yeah, Mark, let me just come back on Paratici as well, because I do take the point that it's really not a good look. I think the reason he's still there is I think, and this is what I've heard, I haven't had it completely confirmed, that that the transfer window is sort of his main remit, and in all that talk about who would the sort of division of tasks, it was all that Johan Lange was going to be analytics, academy, the club, the date, all that kind of thing. And that Fabio was going to be about the sort of the players, the loan market, and also the transfer window, of course. So I think they probably have said to Fabio, "Look, you're here, you're doing this window, and then we'll talk about it at the end of the month." That's what I think is happening here. And Frank said, didn't he, the other day, we're still paying his wages, he's still working hard, So I think that's the situation. I also, it's not quite I don't think perfectly aligned the idea that they restarted last summer, brought in Paratici, and then Paratici is going after 3 months. I think Paratici was always very close to Daniel Levy. And I think there was a sort of an agreement in place there that then Spurs either decided to honour out of kind of obligation, or maybe they did genuinely think, this is a good guy to have around. Look at his record. He's done well. Why would we not do this? But I don't think it's the case that Paratici was, if you like, kind of part of the kind of shiny new era of the new Lewis kind of family, if you like. So, I don't think it's quite right to say that, big new start. This is an early kind of thing where it looks bad. I agree, though. It's not good optics. It doesn't look good that Paratici wants to leave Spurs for the team who are bottom of Serie A. Let's be clear about that. And I think also maybe it's just worth pointing out here that Vinay is the one who's in charge. If we're thinking about who's going to be making the big decisions about Frank in the next coming days, weeks, and months, I think that's going to be Vinay's job. There's a lot of sort of talk about will Vivian and Charles Lewis kind of come in from on high and make a decision about Frank. From what I hear, and we don't know because it's obviously this is all new territory for everyone, but people who are close to them say that's not the idea. That from the start the idea was they would appoint a sort of panel, if you like, of football experts in inverted commas, and the football would be left to them. And that includes Vinay, it includes Langer, it includes Paratici for now. It's not going to be a sort of Roman Abramovich style scenario where Vivian decides one day, I've seen enough. I see the Arsenal Cup. I see the Bournemouth defeat. That's it. I'm going to make the call and we're moving on. I don't think so. Who knows? Maybe that is how it will play out. Maybe they'll go back on what they thought. But the plan is that Vinay is the one who makes that decision. And I think what we can say is that Vinay, of all of these personalities, is very close to Frank. He has a lot of faith in him. That relationship there is quite strong. It's not to say that he isn't aware of the fact they're 14th and that things could get worse. I'm not saying that. But I do think that at the moment, the talk is, and I don't know what Tom said whilst I was on a call 10 minutes ago, but the talk is that, they're in it for the long road. They want to give Frank, in inverted commas, a proper go.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what he was saying as well. And in that case, they're probably sitting down right now having a cup of coffee, hopefully not in an Arsenal mug, and looking ahead to this game at the weekend. It's a must-win
Villa,
game.
let's talk about it.
It is a must-win game, but as I was saying beforehand, if Villa put out a full-strength team and Spurs are missing the players they are, it's not looking good, is it?
It's going to be tough, and I think Villa probably will rotate. I do. I think Frank, from what he said, and we'll hear more this afternoon, I think he might not rotate as much as we've seen in previous seasons, in these kind of cup competitions. I think he is aware, let's see, but I think he is aware of the importance of this game. And he probably realizes that basically, the Cups kept Ange in a job last year. Let's be frank about it. Last season, Ange probably would have been sacked in November if it wasn't the fact they had the Carabao Cup, they had the FA Cup, they had that week, do you remember, where they had basically Ange kind of on the line and they lost all of them, but they were still in the Europa League, So these sort of extras, if you like, are important, not just for the club and the fans, but also for Frank's job prospects as well. It's a huge game, and we come back to that point, which I think we sort of say every week, that one good win, one big win at home, one statement performance, and suddenly everything can feel a little bit different, and it is worth saying, I think, what you've said about the Bournemouth game. You look at the stats, and I've been looking at the data this morning, the numbers, they're all quite encouraging, And I know that, fans won't want to hear that because they've lost a game, and I accept they're 14th in the table, which I just think it's unacceptable. And I more than, most have kind of said that I don't think the squad is good enough for Frank, but they shouldn't be 14th, But the numbers for Bournemouth were better. Shots, creating chances, passes, touches, everything was looking better. So can they now take that on, against Villa and and deliver a decent display? I don't know. What do you think?
I hope so. I just don't know. There's maybe it's my heart over my head. There's a part of me that thinks actually they're going to produce a really good performance at the weekend, and they are going to beat Villa, and then they'll beat West Ham at home. And we've got Burnley away. They can win that. And then we'll produce a brilliant performance against Dortmund. And
this is good. This is good stuff, Marcus. I'm enjoying this glass half empty.
This is my heart.
No, half full, sorry.
Not necessarily my head. It's more empty than full. But let's just take one step at a time. I don't know. I really would like to think that there were some signs last night that, you know, in an attacking sense. Of course, the problem seems to be we suddenly look better going forward, and then we see all the fragility at the back. And then the other thing, I watched the Brentford highlights last night, and I'm thinking, goodness me. I mean, Thomas Frank did a brilliant job at Brentford. They kind of look even better at the moment. They've got a fantastic centre forward, a Brazilian now who's scored more goals than any other Brazilian at the highest level. And you think, oh, the way they bring in players and then sell, that's the way to do it. And for some reason, Spurs just never seem to get it right. But I'm clinging to hope.
I think that's an interesting point to make, actually, with Brentford, for example, how they're doing at the moment. And that, you know, I think they're fifth, aren't they? I mean, they're absolutely flying. And I'm slightly, reluctant to kind of, pour huge amounts of praise on Keith Andrews, because although he's done a fantastic job, it does remind me a little bit of the sort of Arne Slot taking over from Klopp. And I think it does sort of shine a little bit of light on, the job that Frank did there. I mean, when you take over a club that is in perfect alignment, to use that word again, in unison, the culture is really strong. You've got good players, but ultimately everything's ticking. If you take over like Slot did at Liverpool as well, I think there is a period of time where you just kind of keep it going, and maybe the real challenge, as it has been for Slot at Liverpool this year, same at Brentford, is it will be next year for kind of Keith Andrews. But it is that thing that Frank keeps coming back to at Tottenham, where it's about everyone being on the same page. It's about everyone behind the scenes. He's talking about Brentford, about, the importance of the people around him there, off the pitch. And I think that's what he's really striving for at Spurs, and of course it suits him to say, that Vinay is brilliant, and that Johan is fantastic, and we're all on the same page and we're in it for the long haul. I understand that, all of that is kind of important, but I think it, and Emery is a great example of this. Villa is a great example of this. Only a few years ago, they were in a similar position to Spurs, if not worse, right down the bottom of the table, looking at kind of being like a relegation kind of club. You get in a manager who's good. You get in a sporting director like Emery did with Monchi, who's on the same page, and now another one, from Real Sociedad is also on the same page, and suddenly things can lift. And Villa haven't made loads of signings. They haven't, signed the world. They've improved the players they've had, and everyone has been on the same page on and off the pitch. I think that's what Tottenham are hoping that Frank can achieve.
All right, Tom, listen, I know you're busy. Your phone will be ringing. We hope that one of those phone calls will lead to confirmation of a £70 million signing just ahead of the Villa game, and the world changes overnight. Tom Allnutt of the Times, we had Tom Barclay earlier, and I think the plan is that we'll all, well, certainly two of the Toms, or two of us anyway, will be back after the Aston Villa game, and we're all going to get together for a Q&A. So do bring your questions in. In particular, we're talking about January transfer windows, best signings, worst signings, who you'd like to see come in. But any other questions as well, you can email us. Tom is very good at just giving us a quick rundown as to the best way to get in touch. Spotify is a good way, by the way. I'm enjoying answering lots of comments on Spotify. So do keep those coming, particularly the gentleman who wished that I was still stuck in a Chinese prison. But you can email us in different ways, Tom, as well, can't you?
Yeah, so it's thetottenhamwaypod@gmail.com, thetottenhamwaypod@gmail.com. And as Marcus says, leave us comments any way you like, really, and we'll sort of sweep them all up and put them into a Q&A pod next week. We really enjoy those pods because we always get really good questions, really good comments and feedback. So if there's something that's on your mind or you disagree with anything we've said, probably lots of things, I imagine, then just let us know and we'll address them next week. And please do subscribe, try us on YouTube. And if you are watching us on YouTube, please do press those buttons, like and subscribe. It really helps us keep going. We really need to, Marcus, do these messages at the beginning of the pod when lots of people are listening, because all the stats suggest that people kind of, tail off.
What?
So this is the point where no one is listening. It's just me and you, and no one is left.
No one switches this. No one switches this pod off. There's actually one other thing I want to say very quickly, and I'm under pressure to go, but I was so saddened to hear of the passing of Martin Chivers on Wednesday at the age of 80. I remember when I first became a Spurs fan, hearing this name, and my brother, who's a few years older, speaking in awe about what he could do as a striker. And there was a period in the early 1970s when I think it's fair to say he was as good as any other striker in Europe. And I saw a couple of comments yesterday actually comparing him to Jimmy Greaves, and he sort of followed in Greaves' footsteps. Definitely one of Tottenham's greatest ever players, strikers, and by all accounts, Tom, a fantastic man as well, a terrific guy to share a beer with, to watch a football match with. He was a great ambassador at the club for many years. So it goes without saying that all of our thoughts here on the Tottenham Way pod go to his friends and family. He'll never be forgotten, will he?
No, well said, Marcus. And I just echo that point that, you know, people really say that he was just a really nice guy, and you see him around a lot, actually, you know, games and training ground and things, and people have always said that, you know, beyond a footballer, he was just a real stand-up, you know, guy to have around as well. So yeah, a big loss.
Thank you, Tom. Rest in peace, Martin. We will remember forever those wonderful goals that you scored, and yeah, the way that you conducted yourself so brilliantly over the past 30 years or so. Right, we'll be back after the Aston Villa game, fingers crossed, for a more positive pod. For now, though, from me, Marcus Buckland, and from Tom and the other Tom, it's, as always, come on, for goodness sake, you Spurs.